Don't you love the voice of God coming through there?
Is that who that
Okay.
is?
So there's one other question, and then I'm gonna call on some students, but I always wonder from a reporter, even, I feel like I've been doing this for a while too, and I don't feel like I have the formula right. What makes something reportable? Like what makes it a good story? What makes it say, what speaks to you when you're like, I think I actually want to explore that?
You asking me that?
Yes. Mhm.
Um, that's a great question. I mean, I think one thing is that there's a moment where you feel like where you have a reaction to something that you heard and you say, I didn't know that. That's the start, right? Like I didn't know that, or I've never heard a story like that, or that gives even if it's like maybe potentially clarifying about something. It's like, oh, I kind of thought the way the world worked and with respect to that issue was this way, but that story kind of pushes up against what I thought I knew, right? And if I feel that way, there's probably a bunch of other people who would have that reaction to the story, right? So that it just sort of feels like that there's something there's an insight somewhere that you can share through the telling of that story. That's probably maybe the single most powerful answer that I would have to that question for me.
Mhm. And
Yeah,
so,
where it's like I feel like I learned something, and that I guess that means that maybe a lot of other people would too
yeah,
if I shared this. Yeah.
yeah. How did seeing white fall into that then?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. To me, that's an incredibly powerful example of that because, and I say this in the series that I lay out in the first episode all the things that were going on that that had me thinking about, wow, what would it mean to do like a series on whiteness and how it works and what it means? And I had 20 years probably earlier, at least 20 or 25 years earlier, I'd read something about, just this framework of looking at racism and white supremacy through the prism or through the frame of understanding whiteness and understanding it as a phenomenon that was invented and that how it functions in the world. So that had sort of been sitting in my head, although I hadn't read much of the work or really understood deeply what it said. But just even having that sort of stored somewhere in the back of my mind that there were people who thought about whiteness and analyzed it and written about it. And then all the stuff that was going on in the 2010s, the 20 teens with, from Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown through all the other police shootings and the massacre in Charleston and the rise of Trump in particular, right, with this kind of white identity politics that he was playing with. And that it just felt like, wow, is that, I think white folks and whiteness are a story. And it was in that time period that I went to that Racial Equity Institute workshop, the one that then I went back and recorded it and used it in the project, but I went just as a participant. I was kind of nudged into it by my boss at the place I was working at Duke. And there was just so many things that were said that were just so clarifying about the history, for example. And I say this in the episode 13, the white affirmative action episode, which is really just based on a 2-hour lecture from that project. That was in particular just sort of like, um, so back to the point about the sense that there's something that you've learned and that you can share with people. It was sort of like just this clarity about here's all these kind of mushy ideas that people have about racism and how real is it and how does it really work in the world, and that story of whatever 400 years of white affirmative action of goodies given to white people because we're white was just so clarifying that I just felt like that was sort of a moment where I felt like, oh, there's enough there's enough here to build a whole series on, right, along with other things that I could pull in but that some of that was almost like this huge like slap upside the head
Mhm.
of like, okay, there's a big enough story here to share with people that could actually you could dream that it might actually shift people's understanding of how the world works.
Yeah. It's interesting
Yeah.
because during Seeing White, every time I listen to it, I identify with the experience because I feel like I've experienced it. I've lived through it. It's like the details and the history. I feel like that I didn't know, but like living in the experience. That's what
Mm.
really made me just identify with this series a lot. So who wants to ask Mr. Biewen a question? I can call on you individually. I see Remy already throwing both hands up. So we'll start with Remy and then we'll go to Elijah. And you're on mute, Remy.
How you doing, Mr. Biewen? A really quick question. And the question is, what made you choose that label for seeing what? Like, I know how you broke down, actually listen to your theory over and over again. The reason I asked you on a personal basis is my wife is talking to me. So listening to this with her, she's actually been listening to me with me and looking through it, seeing her facial expression, her body language. I did not know that. And looking at it, it's like, what made you pick that key thing of seeing?
How did I choose the title? Is here, yeah, yeah. Well, it's a while ago now, but I guess what I think if I look back, um, I guess I realized that what it was sort of the goal of the thing, right, was to help. So I'm sure I considered seeing whiteness because that would have been the most straightforwardly descriptive title of sort of really what I felt we were trying to do with the series. And then I think I just decided that clipping off the Ness just sort of made it a stronger title. So that's really what it meant to me was that we're going to try to go on this journey together and learn to see whiteness more clearly and what it is, how it came into the world, how it functions, and to see it with more clarity. And that's what we're going to do. And then, so yeah, just the title just became Seeing White, just because I felt Seeing White seemed somehow stronger than Seeing Whiteness.
Yeah, it's interesting. You took white, the adjective whiteness. I don't know. It feels almost, it's a now, but it's like it's almost abstract a little bit. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
even sure that I'm not sure that everybody believes there is whiteness. You know what I mean? Like it's a collective,
Right.
yeah, experience or culture so that even in itself.
Well, that very assertion that even that sort of act of saying, okay, we're going to look at whiteness is certainly for most white people in the way we learn to think about race. I think it's provocative from the very start, right? Yeah.
I sure say it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
7 million downloads say it is. And just a reminder, everyone will be writing a short little 150 word blurb on our conversation here today. So Elijah, you're up next in line.
Yes, good afternoon again, Mr. Biewen. Thank you for being here. Um,
Happy to
I
be here.
love when professors assign us stuff, whether it's a listening or a reading, and then we get to interact with the person, the mastermind behind those projects. So I've really loved listening to this. I put it on during my runs and in the shower and all those kinds of things. So I love listening to your work.
Thank
Particularly what
you.
I love though, Professor Smith mentioned how she can relate to like the contemporary stuff, right? And what's happening today. And I agree, but then it's even better because you give this comprehensive history to give us context on how we've got to this point. And you do that through, talking about or talking through what other people have taught. You've played sound bites from their lectures and things like that. So my question to you is just first, can you just kind of walk us through your whole research process of building up this project? But also, I see all those books behind you. Can you just give me maybe top three of your books that you think really apply to what you're talking about in this project? Because I love to read. I don't read as much as I should, of course, right? We could always read more, but I love to read, especially these nonfiction pieces that apply to what we're learning here at Morehouse. So if you could just provide some insight there, I would be really appreciative.
Well, I appreciate the question and the kind words. I'm really glad that this spoke to you, Elijah. Let me ask you your last question first. Really, there were two books that were almost sort of the Bibles for the history, and they get much discussed. And these two people loomed large in the series. Nell Irvin Painter, um, the history of the history of white people, and and Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi. And it's almost a little bit ironic because Ibram X. Kendi, he's still at American University as far as I know,
I'm
Nicole.
not sure if he's.
Uh, I'm not sure if he's moved on from there, but he became known um, for how to be an anti-racist, and then became somewhat kind of controversial. And anyway, he became very well known. But Stamped from the Beginning was written before all that, and to me, that's absolutely his masterwork because it's tells hundreds of years of history of basically how racist ideas, as he puts it, were created and perfected and how they evolved over time and so on. So those would be the two big ones. Um, and that also is part of my answer to your other question, which is the research. So I knew I had done a bunch of what I considered to be reporting on race, which really over many years, which really sort of meant reporting on black and brown folks in different contexts. And but it wasn't it but this was so for example, I knew from the start, I thought, well, I can repurpose a few things. Like I can repurpose the piece that I did, Little War on the Prairie, which was a piece that I'd done 5 years before about my hometown, and that would be a nice way to bring in the history of what happened, what white folks did to indigenous people in this country. And there were things like that that I could pull in, but I knew that in order to go straight at the question of how was whiteness invented, by whom, how did it take root in the world, and was it shaped over time? Those two big books were sort of the main sources, and those two interviews. If I were doing it now, like I've done other series subsequently where I've probably done more research and would have brought in maybe more voices. But this is the first time that I'd done a series like that. And honestly, I also didn't know it was going to be a 14-part series. I thought it was going to be 6 or 8 episodes in the beginning. But once I got into it, the episodes kept getting broken apart because I was imagining one episode that would be like the story of whiteness, and that turned out to be 4 or 5 episodes because once you started telling the story, it's like, okay, we're through episode 2 and we haven't even gotten to the American Revolution yet, and so you had to stop and start the next episode. But yeah, okay, I'm going to stop talking. I hope that kind of answers the question.
Mhm. What did you
And then
find?
the
Yes,
other
it does.
parts
Thank
were
you.
sort of added in.
Yeah, thank you.
Well,
Sure.
let me dig into Elijah's question a little bit more because learning to be a reporter, sometimes it can feel a little overwhelming, right? Like, where did you even find the experts to be like, okay, these are the people's books I'm going to read, and I'm going to quote this particular one, and I'm going to draw in my experience because my boss had me go to this workshop, turned out to be life-changing. Where do you start by finding the books, the experts, the resources when you decide to do a project at this magnitude?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, I mean, Google plays a real role. It's sort of like who's written about whiteness and who's written about. I think I'd maybe seen a book review in the New York Times or something of the history of white people. Um, uh, but then it was like, oh yeah, and when you Google around, it's like, okay, yeah, I'm going to actually buy that book now. And somebody actually mentioned to me Stamped from the Beginning, which I didn't know about when I was a ways into the research, and I'd already read the history of white people. I think maybe I'd even already interviewed Nell Irvin Painter. That's the other thing is just, the good fortune of the fact that these people would even agree to, my interview with Nell Irvin Painter was 2 hours at least. And think Ibram Kendi only gave me 45 minutes, but still I was able to get so much stuff that I, built several episodes around. But yeah, so oftentimes it's just Googling, and then one article or a book or an article leads to another. Yeah, oftentimes.
Yeah. So Jasir, you've been very patient having your hand up, so I'm eager to hear your question.
Yeah, so my question, first I had to agree with like Elijah for and just thank Professor Smith for bringing, the creator and like he said, mastermind of a podcast. That's typically I'm more of like a sports podcast guy, but I kind of did research on this podcast before listening to it. And I found it very interesting just to like understand someone else's perspective on like, history and just like, really breaking it down. And I kind of felt like as I'm listening, like in my paper, Professor Smith, you actually like see it. Like I felt many different emotions as I was listening to this podcast, and I even like sent it to my friends to see like their feedback on it as well. So I just wanted to know, like, it's kind of a two-part question: was how was like the feedback from like the different racial groups deferred since you released the podcast? And then if you can add like an episode like today, like November 6th, 2025,
Oh
based on
man.
the work in 2025, what would you like cater it to and what would you focus on?
Wow, what a great question. All right, let me uh so the first one was about the reaction. I have to say that there has been some there's been some negative reaction, mostly from white people, as you can imagine, that mostly has sort of taken the form of you just like trolling on social media or whatever. But a lot of times it hasn't been very substantive, to be honest. There's been very little that's really very critical or that really looks at it. It's just oftentimes people who didn't even listen. They just saw the title or saw what it was, and they've heard Tucker Carlson or somebody talk about how ridiculous it is that that people are trying to criticize white people or whiteness, and so they just react that way, like, oh, here's more of this woke nonsense. Get out of here with this. Um, but actually, the response has been overwhelmingly positive, and I also I really want to say that I think um, that's another function of whiteness and white supremacy, that I haven't gotten the hate that somebody like Nicole Hannah Jones gets for the 1619 project, or because I'm a white dude, and because I'm kind of a mild mannered guy, and I don't yell, and I kind of try to just lay things out calmly and factually. That probably contributes to that too. Like, it's, people don't have a violent reaction, in part because I'm not like I'm not presenting it with violence. But still, yeah, it's been easily like 50 to 1 over the years, positive reactions to negative that I've ever got. So yeah, and that's actually somewhat surprising, and maybe even disappointing, because maybe I reached the right people who would really be pissed off about it, or just they haven't listened. Because that's, of course, the thing about a podcast too. It's so self-select. The audience is literally the most self-selecting audience you can find. So the white people who've listened, and I'd say the large majority of the listeners have been white folks, but lots of people, right, of all shades, um, are people who are open enough to want to hear something like that. And so that's a self-selecting group of people. If I'm going to do one episode, yeah, that's a great question. There were people at the time who said, well, you should just change the name of your podcast to Seeing White and just keep going like forever. And we could have, you could have just made 100 more episodes and ever since. But if I were to choose one, I mean, one thing I started a newsletter recently. It's called Keeping Score, Keeping SCOR. Comes from Button Down, and I wrote a piece called "The Old the new old racism, I think I called it, shortly after Trump took office a few months ago. And it was basically about how this administration, for all the things that we're hearing about with the authoritarianism and the lawlessness and the corruption and all this stuff, I just took a few minutes to write about the racism and just things like Elon Musk's Sieg Heil on inauguration day, to stuff that J.D. Vance went to Germany and aligned himself with their far right party and lectured Germany on the fact that they're trying to suppress the far extremist far right. Just all the ways in which they have sort of aligned themselves with racists. That would have been a good additional episode to do these days, I suppose.
That sounds like another 14 episodes, but
Yeah, well,
Damien, I see you patiently waiting. Would you care to share your question?
Yeah, so I got a little train of thought I was coming up with as I was listening to you speak, Mr. B1, in response to Jasia's question. And one thing that I was thinking about, and you mentioned briefly, was about how the people who were negatively critiquing your work during Seeing White were mainly individuals who either didn't take time to actually listen to it at all, or there were people that just, like you said, there wasn't really anything substantive to it, and there were people who were influenced by other major individuals who were promoting like a lot of anti-wokeness. So to that point, I wanted to ask, you said really quickly that, the people that you wanted to reach, that you feel like needed to hear it, were not listening to it. And I know you don't mean that you don't think people like you wanted to listen to it, but there were a group of people that you wanted to get this that refused to hear that. And like, could you speak a little bit more to who those people are and like what specifically you would want that to look like? Because when I think about that, I think about people who are like how we discuss a lot of times, oftentimes in college, like people aren't very educated, they don't read, they don't listen, and they don't take the time to inform themselves about what this history actually looks like. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that just a little bit.
I appreciate the question, Damien. And yeah, I'm glad you asked this question, because one thing that I thought a lot about, even when we were working on the series, and in fact, I remember Chenjerai. I think this was a conversation we had behind the scenes. It wasn't in the podcast, but it could have been, where he asked me, how do you imagine the audience, and what do you imagine trying to persuade that audience of? And I said, I even said, are you asking me the question of, are we preaching to the choir? And he said, yeah, I guess I am. And because when I say something like what I just said, that the white folks who are going to listen to this are going to be people who are reasonably progressive and open-minded enough to even hear it and sit down to hear it, right? Does that mean that it basically didn't do anything because it's just already, and I really, really strongly believe that that's not the case, because what I ended up saying to Chenjerai is, even if we're preaching to the choir has a lot to learn, right? Like I think, and that was the feedback that I've gotten from literally thousands of people, for everything from reviews on Apple Podcasts to emails and tweets and whatever, is from white people saying, okay, yeah, that this was very eye-opening and gave me a lot of clarity, and maybe moved me from having a kind of general posture of not wanting to be racist, and understanding that there's racism in the world, and to having a much clearer and deeper understanding, and also coming to see that, oh, I might have to actually do something, right? Because this is something that I've expressed both in that podcast and elsewhere too, which that was sort of a journey that I went on, was going from, like, I'm not part of the problem, right? Like, I'm not one of the, like, uh, tiki torch carrying, or Confederate flag waving white supremacists out there, and I'm not discriminating against people of color, and I'm not telling racist jokes, and so I'm one of the good people, so I'm good, right? That's my job done, is not being part of like a affirmative part of the problem. But actually, if you understand how deep systemic racism is in the culture and in our institutions, you realize that it's going to be up to some critical mass of white people to putting our shoulders to the wheel to change that, to help to change that, right? It can't just be left to black and brown people to fight that fight, right? So that I think that in a way has been how I see what I hope this project has done for some people, and I think it has, and we've heard that from a lot of people that okay, in whoever it is, like in my job, in my corner of the world, I'm going to try to figure out how to actually contribute um, or to be an ally to the black and brown people in my institution or whatever, rather than just being like this neutral, good white person that's not doing any harm. Right.
Can I say something real quick, Professor Smith? I know it's 12:42.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I appreciate that. I'm taking an interracial communication class with Professor Keisha Tassi here right now. And
Mm.
I think it was during our chapter, I want to say chapter 5 or chapter 6 analysis in our textbook. One of the things that we went over was I can't remember the name of the theory right now, but it's essentially when you introduce a person who's white to a minority culture and you expose them to the role that they play in systemic racism and the different parts of it. And I think that what you mentioned about how a lot of white people who don't identify themselves as being racist stop before they can get all the way to the sixth part. And that's the last part that you mentioned is realizing that just being white and just being part of the macro culture that institutionally oppresses groups of people underneath, they are just being a part of it requires them to do work in order to allow other people to access because there's a glass ceiling that prevents people that are minorities, black, brown, anybody else within that minority culture group from having the same rights, having the same abilities, and having the same upward mobility in society. So I appreciate you confirming that because that's not something that I've ever had, like, someone that was white confirm that before. Something we talk about in the HBCU. So yeah, I just want to say thank you for that.
Yeah, me either, Damien.
Yeah,
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
no
Yeah,
problem.
no, it's a really important. I think it's a really important thing, and that's something that absolutely that I through the process of working on that 14-part series that I got infinitely more uh, 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 understanding of and clarity about that I wouldn't have had, 15 years ago, 10 years ago.
The beautiful part is that you provided so many people, white or not white, clarity. So I hope you feel that. And I think this podcast is actually going to be part of your legacy. Remy, you want to take us home? You got 30 seconds to ask your question.
Super quick question. So I wanted to say how I appreciate that at the beginning of your podcast, you use the DL comment where Barack Obama is what America used to do, but now Trump is what we really are. And when I first listened to episode 1, and I kept playing that one piece of act, and even as a black man, I had to step back and say, wow, that actually makes sense because we want to be the good person as a country. We want to be kumbaya and everybody's great. We're all together. But the reality is, like we said, the only way for us to get there, and what thing I'm just what's to get there is for those who truly need to have these conversations to come to the table and have these conversations. So, as I take it, I guess, do you think in your book, do you think that in your series, do you think that's something that's coming? And do you think that things like this happening now, this particular administration, is something that will help those conversations happen more? Or
Uh,
So
well,
I'm
you
sorry,
know,
Mr. Biewen. So let me just for clarity, if anybody didn't catch that, Remy was referring to the D.L. Hughley conversation on The View at first, where it was like, this is
yeah,
what Obama represents what we'd like to be. Trump is who we are, and that contradiction. Go ahead, Mr. Biewen.
yeah. I just since then, of course, then we had 2020 and we had the racial reckoning and we had, oh, okay, everybody. And by the way, Seeing White got, you know, 3 million more downloads that year alone because it was one of the resources that people were pointing to learn about white supremacy and the history of white, And it's like, okay, we're going to people in the streets, and we're going to turn the corner on race in this country in a way we never had before. And then, of course, there was just this big backlash, and we went back and then reelected Trump again. And so it all feels sort of, it feels like a really a long slog, and it is, right? Of course, it is 400 years and counting now, right? But but I'm not without hope, and I think that one thing that I say, by the way, about all of this stuff that has come out that now gets dismissed as wokeness, which is, people telling deeper, clearer truths about truer stories about the history of the country, and trying to acknowledge the way things are and the extent to which we still have racism and discrimination and all this stuff. That stuff doesn't just get all stuffed back into the toothpaste tube just because there's a backlash to it. And so I think there is if you sort of look beyond the immediate yelling about, the anti wokeness and all that stuff, that there is a considerable trend of, just if you look at the last 50, 60 years, of more and more people having an understanding and being open to telling the truth about stuff. We just still have a long way to go. I mean, uh, no Democrat wins the White House with just white people. I think the last one to win the white vote was Jimmy Carter, you know? So, I mean, and even the moderates who won governorship in Virginia, and at least Virginia, the majority of white folks voted for the Republican. So white folks are white folks are a problem. I mean, let's be real.
Well,
Lots of work to do.
so it just the time goes by when you're speaking truth, doesn't it? So we're we're out of time.
Time flies when you're,
Time flies
yeah,
when you're unearthing some good
yeah.
knowledge and truth.
Now I
But
got to get ready to go teach my students. So.
yeah.